Good afternoon. I'm Peter Thomas, Executive Director of the Marine Mammal Commission. The Commission is pleased to sponsor this Capitol Hill Oceans Week session on Indigenous and local knowledge and wisdom for strengthening conservation. The Commission was founded in 1972 when Congress passed the Marine Mammal Protection Act. Among the host of visionary environmental statutes enacted in that important era, the Act incorporated the concept of restoring and maintaining marine mammal populations as functioning elements of healthy ecosystems. The Act generally prohibits harassing, hunting, capturing, or killing marine mammals, but exempts certain activities from this prohibition, including taking by Alaska Natives for purposes of subsistence or creating and selling authentic Native articles of handicrafts and clothing, provided that the taking is not accomplished in a wasteful manner. A 1994 amendment to the Marine Mammal Protection Act allows the federal government to enter into cooperative agreements with Alaska Native organizations to conserve marine mammals and provide co-management of subsistence use by Alaska Natives. Implicit in this is the belief that a cooperative effort to manage subsistence harvests that incorporates the knowledge, skills, and perspectives of Alaska Natives is more likely to achieve the goals of the Marine Mammal Protection Act than is management by the federal agencies alone. The expertise of Alaska Natives in observing and understanding the environment and the ecosystems of which they're part extends back many decades in personal living memories and much farther back into the knowledge that has been handed down from past generations. As environmental conditions rapidly change, this knowledge helps guide how to respond season to season and year to year to changing ice, sea, and weather conditions, and to understand the effect of those changes on the availability of the marine mammals and other species upon which these communities depend. One of the most effective ways for us to learn is to listen. Over 20 years ago, in February 2000, the Commission hosted a workshop on impacts of changes in sea ice and other environmental parameters in the Arctic to review from both traditional knowledge and Western scientific perspectives how changes in sea ice and other environmental parameters might be affecting Arctic living resources and the indigenous cultures and practices that depend on those resources. The group of experts saw that these rapid changes would have severe impacts on the lives of northern Alaskan coastal communities. They predicted correctly that the changes already being seen in the Arctic were the early signs of changes in climate likely to affect much of the world in the next several decades. One of the lessons carried forward from that workshop 20 years ago is that it is essential that Alaska Native subsistence communities be involved in research and policy concerning environmental change, and that more systematic use should be made of the expertise that they have in observing the environment. As climate change affects more and more communities of the world, this message of how Indigenous and local knowledge strengthens our understanding of the planet and improves conservation-based decision-making becomes ever more important. The Marine Mammal Commission is honored to support this session on Indigenous and local knowledge and wisdom for strengthening conservation. We look forward to listening and learning from this impressive panel of speakers. Finally, we commend the National Marine Sanctuary Foundation for once again organizing such a meaningful week of ocean conservation.
Good afternoon to you all. Senator Lisa Murkowski here. I am encouraged that this year's conference features this specific session, as traditional knowledge, representation, and leadership are essential to enhancing our understanding of the oceans. This is especially the case in my home state of Alaska, where Alaska Natives have lived off our lands and waters since time immemorial, accumulating extensive knowledge and wisdom of everything from food web interactions to ocean currents and sea ice dynamics, all important for sustainability. I work to keep Indigenous voices at the forefront of my conversations here in Washington, D.C. One example of this is the Arctic Policy Act. This is legislation that I introduced last Congress, which takes steps to increase local and Indigenous voices in federal science and policy in the Arctic. The bill aims to improve coordination and collaboration across agencies to advance an integrated plan for the Arctic, including establishing an advisory committee with local and tribal involvement. The idea here is if we're developing guidelines, rules, and best practices in the Arctic, it is only logical that those that have called the Arctic home for centuries have a seat at the table. This is just one example, but it's a reminder that no matter the policy, if we're discussing an initiative that impacts Native communities, including their input, feedback, and traditional knowledge is vital and will only serve to strengthen the final product. I hope the rest of your event is both informative and successful. Thanks again for letting me take part. Take care.
Bonjour, bebam kamiganan Indigenous, Bodwadmi and Dow, Shishi Bayak de Bendegueslands, or Ann Arbor, Michigan, Doshbia. Hi, everybody. I'm Kyle White. I'm a member of the Citizen Potawatomi Nation, and I work at the University of Michigan. My work is primarily on empowering Indigenous people to address climate change and environmental issues like environmental justice, as well as food sovereignty. And I'm really thrilled to have a chance to be in dialogue with the amazing folks that are part of this session, and really just want to say miigwech and thanks to them in advance for their values, their commitments, and the important impacts that they bring to our world and to conservation. And so we're going to start off by having each of these fantastic panelists introduce themselves. And the panelists are Ilarian Murkowski, Siobhan Smith, Ayanna Flewellen, and Allison Smart. And then after we have had a chance to introduce ourselves further, I have I have a question or two that I'm hoping that our amazing colleagues can speak to. And just one note in advance that in terms of the folks who are here with us in this session, we've got some like amazing credentials happening here, whether it's as knowledge keepers or knowledge gifters or directors or folks with advanced degrees, but we'll be running on a first name basis for our proceedings. So in terms of introductions, I'd like to ask Larry to introduce yourself.
Kela machamna kela kasuda angwan tingunangan way unanganasata Kuya. Kawalangan way. I said good morning. The morning tastes good, which is the way our people say good morning. We have been out in Bering Sea for time immemorial, but according to the archaeologists, over 10,000 years. But we use time immemorial. And I said that my traditional name is Kuya, which means like an arm extending out from the body, a carrier of ancient knowledge into modern times, a messenger. And I got that name at 4 years old, and now I'm living the legacy of my name. Thank you.
Thanks for your introduction, which we appreciate. Siobhan?
Akwe Winnie Kesut. My name is Siobhan Smith, and I'm from the Shinnecock Indian Nation. I live here on Long Island on the eastern end of New York in my traditional homelands, well, what remains of my traditional homelands. I'm a member of the Shinnecock Indian Nation and have worked for the tribe since 2006. Currently, I serve as the environmental director, and so part of my biggest responsibility is helping to form the policies and the standards by which we live to contain and maintain our peninsula that we live on. I'm glad to be here, and I look forward to the discussion and look forward to hearing from everybody else and learning something as well as sharing. Thank you.
Thanks so much for sharing your introduction. Ayanna?
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Dr. Ayanna Omilade Flewellen. I am the co-founder of the Society of Black Archaeologists, as well as a board member and instructor with Diving with a Purpose, Both are nonprofit organizations really dedicated to environmental and cultural preservation work. I'm really excited to be here in conversation with so many scholars around the ways in which we practice an embodied sort of understanding of science and an embodied understanding of oceanic conservation. So thank you all.
We appreciate your introduction. Thanks for sharing. Allison?
Miigwech, Ani, Ellison, Indigenous COS. My name is Ellison Smart. I am the Environmental Division Manager at the Little River Band of Ottawa Indians. I am a citizen of the Sault Ste. Marie Tribe of Chippewa Indians located here in Michigan. My role is spending a lot of time working with wild rice or monomen, and conservation with wild rice is where most of my background's in. And now I do a lot of work with environmental issues as well as reviewing permits and policy impacting tribes in the Great Lakes region.
Thanks for your introduction. We appreciate it, and yeah, good to have a chance to hear from folks in terms of the who you are and the work that you do. So I'd like to shift to the topic of our session, and it is Indigenous and local knowledge and wisdom for strengthening conservation. And when I hear the title and I hear those words, I immediately think about my own experience, from a Potawatomi perspective. Potawatomi people have their own ways of defining, including in the Potawatomi language, what those terms and concepts mean. We're doing our own work to protect our communities. We're doing our own work to connect with other Native people and other communities that we want to work with to strengthen our approaches to conservation and environmental protection. But then when I have the privilege to connect with Indigenous folks and people of color and people from other diverse communities, I learned that they mean different things too about some of these concepts that we're articulating here, in a certain type of English language. And so for each of you, I was curious when, you hear the terms or see the terms, Indigenous and local knowledge and wisdom for strengthening conservation. What does that mean to your work? What does that mean to you? And what would you like to share about what you do and what you understand and what your approaches and values are in light of this topic? And so I'd like to begin with Larry.
Yeah, well, first of all, I would like to thank you for using the word traditional knowledge and wisdom. The elders that I work with say that, knowledge without wisdom is superfluous and may be dangerous. And this is traditional knowledge and wisdom. I encourage everyone to use that term instead of traditional knowledge and local knowledge. Our knowledge is beyond the local. And I was born and raised on St. Paul Island in the middle of the Bering Sea. And what we know about not only our local area, but the entire Bering Sea surpasses what is already known by Western scientists, I think. Anyway, St. Paul Island is a small island. It's 12 miles long and 5 miles wide. And when I was a child, we had 1.2 million northern fur seals, 2.5 million seabirds, 1,000 reindeer, and 450 Unungan people. That's what Westerners call Elliott, but we don't use that word because that's our word given to us by our former oppressors. It was a remarkable place to be raised with all these animals. And I guess the best way to answer your question would be to tell some stories. Back in 1977, our people noted very unusual things that were happening to the marine environment. The birds that migrated to the island Several of them had their breastbones sticking out, their chest muscles caved in. The chicks were falling off of cliff ledges in greater frequency than ever in living memory. Sea lions, stellar sea lions, were chasing after seal pups and eating them in greater numbers than ever in living memory. Fur seal pelts, when we take the pelt off of the animal and flesh the fat, we could see light through it, and we never saw that before. And so this told us these were nearshore foragers, distance foragers, depth foragers, surface foragers, all having difficulties. And so we knew that what was happening was an ecosystem-wide phenomena, not just a local phenomena. And we tried to flag these to the government, state and federal, for years, but our information was considered anecdotal, maybe a useful piece of information or maybe not. They didn't know. And so what we did was to, we couldn't find an independent scientist in the US. They were all employees of some organization who had a mission of their own. We wanted to find scientists that didn't have any connection to the Bering Sea. So I approached the Shirshov Institute of Oceanology in the Russian Academy of Sciences, and I talked with Michael Flint, who was the deputy director at that time. He oversaw 1,000 marine scientists, and told him what we're looking for, and he got it. He said, yes, we would love to participate with you Unangan people on study of the question, what is happening in the Bering Sea? And we already had our ideas about what was happening, but we wanted to verify that with Western science. And what they practiced was transdisciplinary science, not interdisciplinary science. Transdisciplinary science is where all the members of the team are equally competent to operate in the other members of the team from different disciplines. And so I thought this is as close to native ways of knowing that I could find, because native people look at things from holistically. Science, Western science, takes about pieces of creation and studies it in hopes of understanding what's happening to creation. Whereas native people, we look at the whole. And when scientists come out and to study, what the fur seal population is, that's all they study. That's their mission, and they're statutorily mandated to do that. But we can see connection between the seals, the sea lions, the seabirds, and the ocean, and the temperature, and all these kinds of things. So we were the first ones to flag climate change, but we couldn't get anybody to listen to us. And so the elders, just to give you an example of what we know, the elders on my island said, the seabirds are like honeybees. They send out their messengers to find the food and then come back and signal that to the colony. Well, we couldn't get anybody to listen to us, but the Russians did. And so Dr. Alexander Golovkin, who studied seabirds as indicators of the health of marine ecosystems, said, yes, there's a way to show what's happening, because we have two least auklet colonies a quarter mile apart from each other. Let's see if they eat in different locations. And so sure enough, we found that the one colony was foraging within a quarter mile of the island. The other one was foraging 200 miles away. And so that showed the people that, yeah, probably what the elders are saying is true. So I took this to National Marine Fisheries Service and said, look at this. And the elders are saying the fur seals are the same as seabirds. And so I said, what would it take to fund it, to make sure that this research is done? They said, well, about $450,000. And I said, well, okay. I went to Washington, D.C. and talked to Roland Smitten, who is the head of National Marine Fisheries Service for the nation, and invited him to St. Paul Island. He came there and spent a week, and he said, okay, what do you need? And so we got the $450,000. And they found out that the fur seals in different locations on the island did, in fact, forage in different locations. So this is just one indication of what we know. To personally, for halibut fishing, we fish for halibut for subsistence, for a hook, line, and sinker. And I can tell you when the halibut is coming to the line. I can tell you when it bites, if it's hooked by the lip or the jaw or the side of the body. I can tell you whether or not it's male or female. I can tell you what size it is. I can tell you how it's going to fight on the way up. This is something that I knew by age 11. Now, we underestimate what natives know. University of California one time were interested in the question, do halibut forage above the bottom? And they spent $300,000 and commissioned a mini submarine to study it. I knew that answer when I was 11 years old. This was, again, and I could tell you where the water line, the sand bottom is to the rock bottom. I can tell you where the big rocks are, where the small rocks are, where the halibut breed, and where you can find the females. I can tell you all that. And that's just one person. The scientists need to understand that we have our ways that need to be inputted, not incorporated into Western science, but partnered with Western science. And we need the financial capability to put together the kind of mechanisms that Western science can work with, which we don't have. So,
thanks so much, Larry. That was amazing sharing, and I'm I'm super appreciative. I'd like to move on and check in with Siobhan.
Hi again. So yes, I do. I too want to say, Larry, that I appreciated hearing you speak, and I recognize some of the similarities in different relationships. So once again, I work for the Shinnecock Indian Nation, where I also live. The Shinnecock Indian Nation, for those of you who may not know, is located on the eastern end of Long Island in the state of New York. So Shinnecock itself is a peninsula, and it's surrounded by Shinnecock. To the east is Hetty Creek. To the west is what's called Old Fort Pond. And down to the kind of like the southwest area, the bay is protected from the Atlantic Ocean by a barrier island. But the barrier island has an inlet that is routinely maintenance dredged. And so it allows a lot of that ocean water to come into the bay. And with that also comes the energy. So here on Shinnecock, we have the situation where we're trying to maintain a quality of life for the tribal members that reside here, where at the same time maintaining space and habitat for all the animals that we share this space with. And so one of the things that we are always constantly trying to address is the erosion that we're facing. So there's a lot of sand loss and land loss that's taking place along the peninsula of Shinnecock. And at the same time that we're trying to maintain our existence, the wetlands too, the plants in the wetlands are trying to maintain their existence. So they're all kind of moving and migrating northward. And so you have this dynamic where the soil is changing and the plants are changing and the wetlands are moving more and more into the residential areas. But it's important for us to maintain both that. So we're looking for ways that will kind of, reduce the loss of the shoreline so that there is enough space for everyone and everything. And so a lot of the times, the effort that we put forth is more of in line with what is naturally already there. And so a lot of the work we had previously done with our partners, right? So like Larry was speaking about the necessity for resources, and oftentimes tribes don't have the resources to really bring to fruition those plans and those ideas and those concepts that they have, that they know will work for the area that they live in, because they're familiar with the dynamics and they understand what's happening, and they recognize the changes that are coming. And they, when you're in your community, you spend a lot of time thinking and seeing and saying, well, maybe we can try this, maybe we can try that. But it does often come down to resources. But we have been fortunate enough to have access to funding and partnerships that have helped us, do some beach replenishment, do some plantings, and then do some work directly in the water. Like one of the things that we have been doing for the last few years is continuing to build this oyster reef, which a lot of the times when I get asked to participate in things, that's really what they want to hear about, which is a tremendous resource, utilization of a cultural resource. So the people on Shinnecock really in shellfish, like oysters, hard shell clams, soft shell clams. And so using those resources that are already naturally there, but at the same time bolstering the population so that the work that those species are doing is even more effective in terms of slowing down some of that wave energy and improving the water quality. So I won't take up too much time because there are two other panelists that need to speak, but I do, just echo the sentiment that all the different, tribal communities throughout the country all have unique relationships with the environments that they're in, whether it be land-based people, water-based people. And it's important that we recognize the resources are of varying levels. Some people have access to more resources than others. They have access to more funding. Money plays a big part into a lot of things. And so when those who do have the resources come and say that they would like to work with the tribes to help them to address some of their concerns and issues, it becomes very important that the dialogue is a two-way street. And like Larry was saying, that it's a partnership and that it's happening together. And one doesn't supersede the other, but they go hand in hand. It's respect and acknowledgement of people's understanding and different perspectives and how they really, really fit together if you open up, listen, and just talk about it. So thank you to Bootney for the time, and I won't take up any more time from anyone else, but thank you for allowing me to share.
Thanks so much for sharing, Siobhan. In addition to what you shared, I appreciate those connections you were making with what Larry shared as well, and appreciate the spirit of dialogue that we're bringing to this conversation. Yeah, I'd like to check in with Ayanna.
Yeah, thanks so much. Hearing Larry and Siobhan speak really reminds me of the ways in which the futurity of oceanic conservation work really starts with knowledge is carried by the people who tend and steward their lands as an everyday practice. And I really do wonder what it would look like to sort of flip the paradigms of knowledge production and really start not with institutions or academics, but with communities. As Larry said, he's known this information since he was 11. So the work that I do with Diving with a Purpose and the Society of Black Archaeologists are really working with and tending to the really intimate connection between environmental conservation and cultural preservation work, really at the nexus of the Atlantic Ocean, specifically with the history of the transatlantic slave trade and its afterlives. So Diving with a Purpose, excuse me, is a nonprofit organization really dedicated to conservation and protection of submerged heritage resources. And there's a specific emphasis placed on the projects that we're involved in that center on shipwrecks pertaining to the transatlantic slave trade, and really thinking about the ways in which the history of these wrecks also involve the sort of environmental and oceanic conservation work that really ties these ships to the present in really specific ways. So when I think about diving with a purpose and the training opportunities that we provide to recreational scuba divers around the world, really working with the National Park Service, NOAA, the Smithsonian's National Museum of African American History and Culture, um, here in the United States, as well as in theaters in South Africa and Mozambique, just to name a few. We're really focused on what it looks like to cultivate oceanic stewardship at a community level. And this more specifically shows up in the relationship that the organization has with the Society of Black Archaeologists, which is another nonprofit organization that I'm a part of that really is dedicated to creating and fostering more avenues of access for historically excluded populations, specifically those of African descent, to be involved with the field of archaeology and cultural preservation work while centering communities that are impacted by this research. So this partnership between DWP and SBA really centers on flipping the understanding of how knowledge production is made and how work can be done in cultural preservation and oceanic um, conservation work to really center on moving from the community first, or what it looks like to think through us being in service to communities, part of communities, rather than in service of institutions. So because I also don't want to take up too much time and I really want to dive into further conversation with the other panelists, I'd love to just think through what that looks like and what moving in that sort of paradigm forward could be, especially in this specific environment at CHOW where we're in conversation with these groups head on. How do we really shift the conversation that starts with communities that doesn't really think about what collaboration is, but really, what does it mean to actually give the resources and funds to communities to do this work on their own?
That's really great what you shared, Ayanna, and thanks so much for taking us through these ideas and philosophies and projects and work. I'd like to check in with Allison.
Hey, Rich. Um, First of all, thank you to my fellow panelists and everything that you've shared so far today. Um, Larry's talking about how he has known certain parts of his relationship with different organisms really hit home to me in a lot of the things that I work with. One of the biggest issues we face is that indigenous knowledge and wisdom does not hold the same level of value as westernized science. So when making comments on permits or changes to water quality standards in the Great Lakes region, I'm located right now on the coast of Lake Michigan, about 90 miles across the lake from Green Bay, Wisconsin, a little bit bigger city that people know. But being where we're at, anytime something goes forward, we may have indigenous knowledge in our community that because it's indigenous knowledge and it's not westernized science, we struggle to defend the protection of different species that are important to our community because of the fact that we don't have this hard science data. And I've experienced this a lot with working with wild rice, that we don't have that hard westernized science data on Monoman, but we have a lot of indigenous knowledge. So as a scientist, there are times, as a westernized trained scientist who is also indigenous, there are times where my elders will tell me something and I'm sitting there trying to translate that to my fellow westernized scientists, and then at the same time they're like, well, where's the data? And I'm like, okay, I now have to go waste $400,000 to find out something that we know. And I think that's one of my biggest frustrations with combining those two worlds, is that we have the answer. We just don't have a bunch of data points that can go on a graph to make westernized scientists happy. So with that, I definitely want to leave us time for a lot more discussion as we move forward and dig into some of these other questions that we hope to discuss today. So I'll leave it at that.
Thanks so much for sharing, Allison, and really appreciative to hear about what you shared, and the work and some of the challenges, and just reflecting on what each of you brought to us. What each of you brought to us. I mean, so many different aspects tied to knowledge, whether that's engagement with science, whether that's policy issues, whether it's the empowerment of our communities and leaders and issues where our knowledge and our knowledge systems are critical, to also connections to culture and what it means to grow and to build our communities and to exercise self-determination. And all of you are doing such powerful things in this area of marine conservation. And so, based on obviously what you've heard from others, but also just in terms of what you may have already been inclined to share. I'd like to check in with each of you again to see if you'd like to share any thoughts about what your sense is of what a future would look like in marine conservation that would be a good place for our knowledge systems, and a good place for our communities, and it would create the types of outcomes that matter to us, and it would reflect the values of many of our communities. And so, anyways, I'd like to ask Larry if you'd be interested in sharing on that question.
Yeah, thank you for that. Yeah, by the way, I'm a board member of the National Marine Sanctuary Foundation, so I have direct ties to this whole event. And so I'm glad to be in this panel. You know, people, the scientists have real difficulty in learning from indigenous ways because they're not schooled to do that. And their mission from, usually they work for some agency or university, and they dictate what their priorities are, which may not necessarily be local priorities and usually is not. And you take a scientist from any discipline today and tell them to do this traditional knowledge and wisdom stuff, they'll be like kids who are just learning. And it's very uncomfortable for a scientist to be put into that kind of position. Um, what we know is like I said, holistic. We know that the whole is greater than the sum of its parts, and they interact because they interact synergistically. And this way of knowing is considered anecdotal. It's useful, maybe useful piece of information they don't know. And the unfortunate thing in terms of making it a reality is, let me give you one quick story again. In Caucus, Alaska, which is in the center of Alaska, the state of Alaska cut down the subsistence take of moose from the local Dene people, and the 7 tribal chairmen got together with the scientists to hear the scientists' explanation of why they're cutting down the take of moose. And he explained that he's doing aerial transects, doing the ratio between bull and females. And the chiefs listened very patiently. And then after 45 minutes, the head chief said, "Did you notice the water levels going down in the river?" And the scientist said, "No, I'm doing aerial transects. I'm not doing water study. That's a different discipline." And he said, the chief said, "Well, do you know that when the water levels go down, the forage that moose eat disappear?" Says, "No, that's another discipline." And the chief continued, "Do you know that there are more beavers now in all the rivers here in the area?" And he said, "No, that's beavers is another study." And he went on explaining these connections. And the guy was earnestly trying to find a way to hook them up, and said, "Well, why don't you talk to the Board of Game?" And you could hear the silent moans from the chiefs, because The Board of Game is mandated to use the best available science, and by definition, native ways of knowing is not best available science. What they can do, if they're willing to partner, the elders say that all the species that we have known since we were children are going down big time. And that you think that there are a lot of animals here in Alaska today. When I was a kid, the average king salmon was 150 pounds. Now you say 60 pounds is big. And, the caribou, they used to cross the river a mile wide and go for 3 days. Today they go a quarter mile and go for 3 hours. They're saying that since Western science came into being, everything has been going down. So this is ripe territory for critically thought out partnerships between Native people and the Western science. And if we do this, we will help Mother Earth to heal. We will restore what we had before. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Larry. And I'm without like screwing anything up. I just wanted to say that at least one of the many points that you raised that had just resonated with me right now is that scientific organizations, especially like ones that I'm familiar with that aren't even comfortable with the word wisdom, they really need to change. The actual institutions need to change, like profoundly change. um, you know, I just appreciate your.
And what I would add is that, we're trying to bring this to Alaska by proposing the first marine sanctuary in Alaska, and that's the Unungan Heritage National Marine Sanctuary. And we're in our 5th year of review now, and so it's the final year, and we hope that everyone here would support it.
I'd encourage everyone to support too, and
it's being launched by the city of St. George, which is a sister village 40 miles away.
Well, I just want to pause and encourage folks to really strongly consider what Larry and our colleagues here have shared to support, an effort, to support that effort, because everybody here has shared actions, things that they're doing, things that they've been doing for a long time, and it's important to have that collaboration and that support. I'd like to check in with and ask Siobhan if you'd be willing to respond to the question.
Sure. So I don't want to just reiterate what Larry said. So I wanted to just take it from a slightly different perspective. So as I had mentioned before, we know the work that needs to take place here in our territories, and oftentimes we know the best way to do it. And again, it gets back to having access to resources. And I spend a considerable amount of time in my job looking for funding, right? And there's all these various streams of funding sources and lots of grants that come from these big agencies, but they all are based on those agencies' priorities. And so you spend a lot of time trying to fit the work you need to have done into these narrow priorities. And really what needs to happen is before those RFPs even make it out into the world, we need to be able to be a part of that process, that planning process that takes into consideration the work that we're trying to do, the work that is valuable in our communities, because in the end, it benefits everywhere. Water, it knows no boundaries. So if we're protecting the water here at Shinnecock, everybody in the surrounding communities is going to benefit from that. And so I'll be brief. I just want to say that the discussions around how agencies handle and allocate funding is something that really needs to really be looked at and given some more consideration to how Indigenous communities need to prioritize the work they need to do. So I'm going to thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Siobhan. And, again, kind of without screwing up the richness of what you shared, one point among the many that you brought up that really struck me is that I'm currently writing a few grants, and again, it's a similar setup, right? The the funding program has come down to us, and it says things like traditional knowledge. Again, wisdom's not referenced at all, um, and I kind of think, and I think those that write those policies need to kind of understand this, is that when, at least in my case, when I see something like that, I'm like, who are these people? What,
Right.
like, right. Why do they believe that they have the right to define for us, what these concepts means, what acceptable funding means, what a proper program means, or even going back to a point that Larry had also mentioned, what a discipline is, or a field is. And I really appreciate each of your making extremely practical statements that this situation absolutely needs to change. But I know so many people that it's not even on their radar. They actually think it's just a great thing that there are grant opportunities for tribes. So I appreciate you both, and the points that you were making about that. Makes me feel better that I'm not alone. I wanted to ask Ayanna about the question on that we've been discussing.
Yeah, just to echo the choir, I think about Larry sharing, and he mentioned like what it means for scientists to feel uncomfortable when they're confronted with like actually not being experts. And I think that that actually is the perfect position to start from. That scientists need to be uncomfortable. I think that within our disciplines, there's a sort of reveling in a level of expertise. I've spent such and such amount of years doing this work. I am an expert in this field. But what would it actually look like to acknowledge that you're a student, that you're a student who still has so much to learn, and that oftentimes when we're thinking about the collaborations between scientists and communities, and oftentimes those two things are not mutually exclusive, as it is in my case, um, that it's oftentimes the scientists that are teaching communities versus knowledge is flowing both ways. So, what does it look like to actually acknowledge that both parties here are in a practice of learning and are learning in partnership with one another? So, I just want to stress that offering that Larry made, and really ask, the folks who are writing the grants, like if you feel really comfortable in your space in terms of like your collaborations with communities, you're likely not doing likely not doing enough in that regard. Um, and I also think that going back to this real concern around funding and grants, there's such an app there are so many different levels of engagement that must be dismantled to really account for the ways in which indigenous knowledge should be held in those spaces. So I think about, what it means to actually include people not as volunteers, but as consultants that get paid for their labor more specifically. And I think about what it means to actually have reviewers in the room who are people who know about these knowledge formations, who are part of descendant communities, who are indigenous community members. What does that actually mean to have them actually reviewing these grants and raising the question when a grant comes in that's supposed to be with these communities? Why is this person down as a volunteer, not as a consultant? Where's the actual level of engagement here? And that actually being the first and foremost question. So I think about the kind of work that SBA is doing right now in conversations with larger funding agencies about the ways in which funds are distributed, but also about the ways in which funds and grants are reviewed, and how that entire process needs an overhaul if we really intend to provide the kinds of resources that we want to see this really transformative work.
That's amazing and direct, Ayanna, in terms of what you shared. And you know uh, uh, again, not to kind of screw up everything that you shared, but one of your one of your many points that really got to me just now is just how our scientific institutions, the dominant scientific institutions, the whole incentive thing is way off. I mean, for example, I know colleagues that they think it would be pretty generous if in a grant project they offered a knowledge gifter or youth or somebody else from one of our communities like a couple $1,000s. But they're not thinking about the other side of it, which is that those publications they get, for them, if you're just thinking about it in financial terms, that could secure tenure, meaning a lifetime of income. It could secure a good performance review, which provides a raise, which, as we know, a raise is compounded over each year and contributes to your retirement, your improved health care. And if you add it all up, right, sometimes you can say that the researcher, the non-native, non-person of color researcher would get over $1 million or hundreds of thousands of dollars for their involvement, right? Whereas the knowledge gifter, the knowledge keeper would just get that a few thousand and that would be it. And I think people, in my view, need to think critically about, just how off the incentive structures are and just how off the equity is in terms of funding. And something you had mentioned at the beginning about comfort. I've been in so many conversations where scientists don't want to be uncomfortable, and I think, well, shoot, some of people I know and ancestors I have that defended our community. I think all people of color can identify this. I mean, they spent their whole lifetime not being comfortable because they had to stand up to powers that were trying to destroy us and that were trying to cause great harm. They weren't never comfortable, right? Yet they had to do the work. And I think it's important for scientists and who do have privilege and who do have security that it's not, to really put in perspective the often unwillingness with being uncomfortable. But thanks so much again for sharing and for the dialogue. I wanted to ask you, Allison, to share as well.
Well, first I'd like to say I concur with all three of my fellow panelists. Each one has brought to the table very important pieces of the puzzle. To touch on a couple of things, one is always using free, prior, and informed consent when working with Indigenous communities. I think that is highly important that as we start to work together more collaboratively, that becomes very important in any project, any funding source, that free, prior, and informed consent for Indigenous communities and sharing of knowledge is vastly important. The other piece that I wanted to touch on with this is that finding a way to not have Indigenous knowledge and wisdom be so outside of the norm that we can't use it to create water quality standards. We can't use it to argue why a permit shouldn't exist. In the Great Lakes region, we're seeing a lot of change to our main ecosystem. And the tribe I work for and the tribe I'm a citizen of are treaty rights tribes. And so we have the ability to hunt, fish, and gather on 13.8 million acres of the state of Michigan, and harvest species we've been harvesting forever, for time immemorial. And so as we aren't just focused on this tiny little area of Michigan that is our reservation, we're co-managing and truly working towards true co-management with our state and federal partners on these areas. So I truly believe that as we move forward, moving to more of a co-management resource between indigenous nations and communities and other communities, that we can truly have some of these conversations. I wanted to talk a little bit about funding because that did come up. A lot of our base funding from several of our federal agencies and partners have not changed since the early 90s. So we are currently working on funding that is the base funding from 1999, 1995. And when you get into it, $30,000 to do non-point source pollution prevention is nowhere near what it was 2 decades ago. So I definitely think funding can be an issue. And when tribes have the ability or nations have the ability to use funding to utilize to protect those resources, whether it's to decrease runoff into their community that impacts fish habitat or reefs or those types of things, to not have to constantly be in competition with larger communities and other larger organizations for funding to truly complete this work is huge. So I wanted to touch on that point as well, but I think moving towards true co-management and respect and understanding that there's more than just hard westernized scientists to understanding something is hugely powerful and moving, and it will help us move forward in a good way.
I just wanted to add one thing, because when she said about competing with other communities for fundings, and depending on the source of the funding regionally, you're competing with other tribes. They have a pot of money and they're dividing it among the tribes in the region. And so it can create an unbalance and an unnecessary feeling of competition when it shouldn't be that way. Just increase the resources in the region and it makes more for others. So I just wanted to say that when you said competition, it made me think of regional issues as well.
Yeah, thanks
Very
for
much
adding
so.
that. Yeah, thanks for adding that point, Siobhan. I appreciate what you shared, Allison, and the prompting you gave to so many different issues. And our colleagues in the audience, some of the questions they had actually had to do with how to bridge the gap between Western science and Indigenous knowledge, and how to change academia. And I think all of you gave some very good advice for how to do all that and how to respond to those questions. And so I really wanted to thank you all for your sharing, your storytelling, your philosophies, your ideas, and really speaking to the self-determination of diverse people of color groups, and with an importance on wisdom and our knowledge systems. And I hope that everybody here follows all of your work and supports that work too, and takes very seriously the recommendations that you gave. Thank you. Miigwech.